Good afternoon. Today, my buddy TrueMarsh asked me to have a look at a position from a game he played against Marciel99. So let's have a look at it. Over here, black plays queen d8, and this will be the base of the analysis I'm looking at today. In this position, TrueMarsh told me he knew that there was a very strong threat of knight goes to f7. Let's have a look at it. Knight goes to f7 forks black's queen and rook. In this position, black knows he's going to lose either his queen or his rook, so to minimize his loss, he moves his queen away and sacrifices a rook instead of the queen, but still goes on to lose this endgame because white is up a very healthy amount of material. Engine says plus 8.9, so very strong for white. I won't look into this too further because it's a very clear white win. In this position, in the actual game, queen b6 was played, and TrueMarsh asked me to have a look at why this was a blunder. The short answer to that is going to be simply in this position over here. If white had played knight f7, he would have just simply gained a rook and gone on to win. But over here with queen b6, it really depends on what black plays, because black does have some good interesting options to defend against b6, which make the game at least somewhat drawish instead of a win for white. So let's have a look at what happened in the game, because there's some interesting lines to look at. In the actual game, we see black goes for queen c8. And again, TrueMarsh continued with the correct threat. That is knight f7. And in this position, if you're playing as black and if you're either under heavy time pressure or if you're not very highly rated at blitz or bullet, you might not see that even though white is threatening knight takes rook, that's not the dominant threat in this position. The actual dominant threat is knight goes to d6, and in the actual game this was not seen by black, as black goes for the weakest defense, seeing that his rook was attacked and moving it, but not seeing the main threat of knight goes to d6, forks the king and queen, and after king moves, queen is taken, and then this is a simple endgame that TrueMarsh went on to easily romp. So let's go back to this position to see the next tier of things that that black could have done over here, and that is queen goes to b8, for example. The idea over here being that since black's king and queen are 3 spaces apart, they can no longer be forked by the knight. However, black still goes on to lose his rook, as was seen from the fork before. And again, white's in a very strong position, as very similar to what we've seen before. Well, white will go on to win from this position. And although in this position, I should say, in this position, yeah, white is definitely favored to win, heavy plus 9.1. Even though there's no very direct threats on mate from this position, it's an endgame that white's expected to go to win. So let's go back. Those are bad options. What can black do in this position to actually defend, get the most counterplay he can from here? And that is knight goes to d5. Interesting move because it threatens white's queen. And again, black maximizes the amount of counterplay he can get over here. If white chooses to continue by forking the king and queen, as was originally intended, black is in check. Black can no longer defend his queen with his king, because white's pawn over here threatens d7 and white's queen threatens d8. But no matter, after black moves his king, white's queen is still defended by the knight, and that becomes very crucial, because if white continues with knight takes queen, then black takes white's queen, getting the trade, but white still ends up taking black's knight over here and is expected to win this position with a plus 6.3, even though white doesn't have a rook in this position, but black does. White still has a strong material advantage, and this pass pawn over here on e6 is pretty strong, and it can be pushed on to queen, and it's favored to win for white. Although not very straightforward, it's white favored. Back in this position, even if white doesn't take the queen over here, but instead chooses to play bishop d5, continuing the threat on the queen, black's optimal defense is to take the bishop, because that gets the trade for him on the queen, and after white takes queen, black also takes queen, but white takes the knight, and this is the optimal line, the engine says. where again white has two knights and a good pawn on e6. Even though white doesn't have rook, again, it's still favored for white to win because he can push on this pawn using the support from the knights and has good material. So this is the optimal line. Okay. So let's go back over here. We've seen how queen goes to c8 was weak in this, which was played in this game, was a weak move. What can black do over here to try and make the most of it? As you can see, it's plus 0.5, but I think white has squandered his advantage over here. Black can play knight goes to d5. There are several things that white can do. Let's go and increase the order of strength. One thing is white can continue with his threat of knight goes to f7, trying to fork his opponent's queen and rook, but that's actually weak. The engine says from this position, black can simply take the queen, and after knight takes over here, there isn't much counterplay because black can take the bishop here, and even though black's pawn is hanging over here on b7 and white's pawn is also hanging on e6, this ends up being a strong position for black. So white doesn't want to see this. The next thing that white can do is to play bishop d5. If he does that, it's an overall drawn evaluation because after queen takes bishop on d5, even though black's knight over here on c7 is being attacked and not being defended, white has to defend against the imminent threat of queen comes onto g2 with mate, support with the pawn. And from here, white, he has to spend his move defending, so he moves his king to give him some runaway squares, after which it ends up being a drawn evaluation. So again, that's not optimal for white. The best that white can do from this position is to play queen b7. And the interesting thing over here is even though white still has his threat of knight goes to f7, threatening to fork black's rook and queen with the support from the pawn, black has a very sneaky way of getting this defensive. Black goes for queen to a8, and he threatens to mate over here. And the only way that white can stop this is to go for the queen exchange. Again, if so the best move for white over here is to take the queen exchange. And now white's threat is no longer active because if knight f7, sure, it attacks the rook, but there's not too much that he's threatening because the queens are off the board. Black can play something like rook to h7, and it's not as strong as white could have had earlier. So, coming back to the main point, in this position, again the base, TrueMarsh told me he did consider knight goes to f7. He didn't play it though. He played b6. He asked me why this was a blunder. I tell him this is not actually a blunder as you might think, because consider the engine only assumes that both players will play the optimal moves when they're playing their games. They won't keep in mind how a human actually thinks in the position, given their ratings, given time pressure. So I think that queen b6 was not insanely bad, because it does hope, as he told me, that if black goes for queen c8, it's a very strong position. He can continue. And like a human blitz player, black didn't see the threat, and white went on to win by getting the fork. So again, beautiful move we've seen. White goes for taking a human advantage, as I like to call it, by hoping that black wouldn't play the optimal move of knight goes to d5, whereby all he gains with optimal moves is about a pawn. But if in this position, white actually continued by taking the fork instead of hoping that his opponent would not plunder, I would think it's kind of like a high risk, high reward kind of play, which he went for, and in this case, he succeeded. And I wouldn't recommend queen goes to b6 in this position because of the defense, as I mentioned and covered, of what happens if black goes to queen d5. But the bottom line, the moral of the story is over here. If you're playing against high-rated players, especially when you look at the engine lines, you want to simply go for the threat as soon as you can. And that is knight goes to f7 and gain. And gains a rook, wins the game. So that's why it was an interesting position to see. When I first saw the position, I thought, okay, I'm simply going to tell him, of course, you have to play knight f7 and win instead of going for the complex or human idea. But again, that's a good reason why chess can be such a beautiful game, especially when played against humans. And keep in mind, you're playing against a human, you're playing against a player. You're not playing against the bot that played the same position in the spot of your opponent. So again, thanks to TrueMarsh for giving me the opportunity to put out this video about the positions, and have a good day.